The Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and your local cable provider presents Cable Reports. Join us now as Cable Reports brings you up to date on current issues facing the Commonwealth through discussions with your local legislators and other policymakers from across Virginia.
Welcome from the General Assembly and the City of Richmond. I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports and Cox Communications, and we're pleased to have two special guests this morning, Delegate Brenda Pogge from the 96th District.
That's correct.
And Senator Sen Norment, representing the 3rd Senatorial District.
Good morning, Woody.
Well, you're also the Senate Majority Leader. Congratulations and condolences. You chair Courts of Justice and you chair a subcommittee on finance as well. So tell us, does that keep you pretty busy?
I'll tell you, it's amazing the level that incompetency can rise to sometimes. It does keep me very active, Woody, trying to keep all of those balls in the air. I've been very blessed with some leadership opportunities, and I've followed in the footsteps of some very, very effective former senators who have had the privilege of being the majority leader of the Senate or chairing the courts committee. So I feel very fortunate.
And of course, we're into the 45-day short session this year, 2013. Give us the lay of the land in terms of how things are proceeding.
Well, I think things are proceeding at an increased velocity. You and I had chatted earlier about the real challenge of a 45-day session. It's completely morphed into something very different than our predecessors envisioned. We adopt a 2-year budget in Virginia in even years. This odd year session was created initially to just amend the budget to react to whatever the economy did during that 1-year period since the budget was adopted. Now it's a full-blown session. In 45 days, we try to do the same amount of work that would happen in 60 days. And I was saying a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I'm almost starting to believe my own words right now that either we ought to just abolish the odd year session altogether, or we need to extend it to 60 days. We're just not doing justice to the citizens of Virginia under the current system. And
Delegate Pogge, I'm sure you're hearing from your constituents about the bread and butter issues, jobs, and the economy.
Yeah, I sure am. We get emailed all day long. The telephone buzzer just buzzes and buzzes. But yeah, and I think one of the main priorities with the constituents is going to be transportation this year. I think they have an expectation that this is the year that something will come out of the General Assembly, and I know that we're all hopeful that this will be the year.
And of course, the governor has a very ambitious plan. He would make the state of Virginia the first state to do away with the 17.5-cent gas tax and raise more revenues through, among other things, the sales tax. What's been your reaction to that as well as your colleagues in the House of Delegates?
Well, my reaction is this, that as long as I've been involved in politics in Virginia, whether elected or unelected, and that's been about close to 20 years, this is really conceptually the best plan that I have heard come forth. Generally, because there's so much thinking outside the box in this plan, there seems to be parts of it that everybody likes in some way. Nobody loves it, but nobody hates it. And I think it's something that we can work with. I have publicly supported the plan, and I am hoping that this will do the trick. I've crunched the numbers and works out favorably for the majority of Virginia's citizens, and I think this is something we can move forward with.
And of course, Senator, this affects the ability of the state to maintain a AAA bond rating, the ability of the state to recapture its #1 status as a state with a friendly business environment.
Well, Woody, I don't think Virginia's any less friendly. It's position #3 or 4 as contrasted with when it was #1. It's very interesting. Almost since the entire period of time I've been in the General Assembly, Virginia has been nationally recognized as the best place, or certainly one of the best places to do business in America. And that's a combination of our right-to-work law, our comparatively low tax rate. Well, the reason we have slipped is totally because of the deterioration of the transportation infrastructure. If you look at some of the benchmarks that are used to determine the receptiveness of business by a state, transportation is a major consideration. Virginia has slipped to number 33 or number 34 nationally as it relates to that transportation infrastructure. So that is what is dragging us down. And unfortunately, the long-term implications of that are very significant. A lot of sectors, much of our goods and services move across our highway network in Virginia. We were talking about tourism earlier. Right. Brenda and I had the privilege of representing the historic Triangle. We're a drive destination. Visitors drive to the historic Triangle. They drive to Virginia Beach. And when they are caught up in traffic jams or delays, it's certainly not a very good initial impression of Virginia.
And of course, those tunnels that the Senator just described become heavily congested, and God forbid there's a big rainstorm, because they can become a safety hazard as well.
That's right.
And of course, there have been a number of public-private partnerships over the past several years. As I recall, in 2011, the Commonwealth was able to borrow, because of its AAA bond rating at very low rates, money through a bonding process that allowed for new construction throughout the state. And some of those partnerships have caused some controversy, but they appear to be working well now.
Right, that's correct. And I think, too, for folks who live in Richmond, you're used to the public-private partnerships and more tolling, but also having more choices when you travel. You can choose to go 1 or 2 or 3 ways. And in my area, our area, we don't have that option. And so it's something that we're looking at, and people are getting used to the idea that there may be tolls, but hopefully the tolls will be strategically placed where people will continue to have options.
But apparently there are a lot of potholes that need to be filled, and of course we've been borrowing from Peter to pay Paul, although legally speaking we have to maintain the roads before we construct new ones. I assume that your constituents are suffering from some of those potholes just like everyone else.
Well, actually in our district we just got a load of new asphalt on a lot of roads. And it has helped immensely, but still there are folks wondering why that new asphalt hadn't been rolled in new directions. But we have seen potholes being filled all winter.
I think you mentioned as one of the components of the governor's plan earlier is revenue that would be generated, assuming the Congress of the United States can pass a bill that unfortunately has been languishing for some time regarding the taxing of internet retail sales, which of course we all declare and pay already.
Absolutely, sir. Absolutely. Well, I wish it was only that bill that was languishing in Congress rather than the institution languishing. But having said that editorial comment, one of the key components of the governor's transportation program is to capture that Fair Tax Act, which they refer to it, or capturing the sales tax off internet sales and dedicating that exclusively towards transportation. The Congress has not acted on it. So we actually would be betting on the come on that. I know that the governor and his administration are monitoring that very carefully. They have an expectation that it will pass. But if it doesn't pass, it's going to create a very, very significant hole in the governor's transportation plan, and I think that is causing some concern. And a little bit on a partisan persuasion, some of my Democratic friends see that sales tax as being an ingredient that goes into our general fund or our operating account for the state, and to capture that money and dedicate it exclusively to transportation will lead to an argument that it ought to be going in the general fund, and therefore we're taking money away from education. I think it's a pretty shallow argument, but it's certainly going to be out there.
Now, what about the sales tax? There's less than 1% increase,
That's
I
right.
believe, in the sales tax, but we will be more reliant on the sales tax, which gives the state an opportunity, however, to, as the economy grows, put more money into transportation versus the current regime, which is not indexed to inflation at all.
That's correct. And the sales tax, in my opinion, is not, it's not painful. It's reasonable. And the fact that it will increase what goes to the general fund, because the 0.08% will go to the to the transportation fund, along with, in the plan, the 0.5% we already get, which will be increased to 0.75%. So when the plan passes, we will triple what we give to the transportation fund from the general fund. Is that correct, Senator?
I believe it is,
and
yes.
that is one of the drivers of why it will increase so much money for the transportation, because of tripling that portion. And in my estimation, I believe that transportation is a core function of government, and as such, we should be funding it from the general fund. It is something that we absolutely cannot do without. There are other things that we finance from the general fund that, you know, we can't do without them either, but none of them more important in my expectations than transportation. So I'm very pleased that we are making it more involved with the general fund, and that the principle there is that it is a core function of government.
And of course, there's some other fees associated with the governor's plan. I think there's an additional $15 a year registration fee, and then there's a fee on vehicles that use alternative fuels.
That's correct, Woody. Brenda made a very important point that I think sometimes gets lost in the debate. Transportation is a core function of government. And it's not just paired up competing against education. What we are saying is that in the minds of some, these other core functions of government are more important than repairing a deteriorating transportation system. And education is extraordinarily important, but with the proper reallocation and new allocation of resources, we can do both without harming either institution. Now, the fees that you mentioned, yes, there's a $15 fee to, increasing the cost of registration of your vehicle, a $100 fee for the hybrids or alternative fuels. I think you're going to see some pushback on those two fees. There is some resistance to that. And while I know the governor proposed it, I would not be surprised at the end of the day to see those two fees, as we used the word earlier, languishing on the sidelines.
Now, the Senate, unlike the House of Delegates, as I understand it, has not really come to a conclusion about what the governor's initiative is going to look like ultimately. I believe there's been some amalgamation of the bills on the House side. Obviously, that's got to occur pretty soon. I believe crossover is next week sometime.
Well, actually, if I'm correct, the revenue bills, any piece of legislation that has revenues attached to it needs to be reported out by Thursday. That's a pretty short timeline.
Yes.
So it's not just the budget, it's the revenue bills that have a short timeline on it, and you are correct. But the impasse is due primarily to a partisan disagreement. And the House, a significant majority of the House of Delegates are congealing around a particular issue. In the Senate, we have 20 Democrats and 20 Republicans, and we've got raising taxes on one side and using some general funds or new general funds on the other side. So it's an issue that creates a real challenge on developing a consensus. So we're having another prayer meeting this afternoon, and I'm hoping for a little divine inspiration, and I mean that sincerely, on both sides, that a conscience will be stirred that we've got to stop this partisan divide and move forward. We were talking earlier, there's some great headlines. You can go out there and give the one-line quips and get yourself on the front of the Richmond Times-Dispatch or the Daily Press. Doesn't solve a thing.
That's right.
Gives you some notoriety, makes you feel good, and you can swell your chest, but it doesn't do a daggone thing for transportation. And so we're trying very hard to develop a consensus in the Senate that we could pass on a bipartisan basis, but very important, that would not be offensive to the House of Delegates.
Now, I understand you serve on a number of important committees, not the least of which is education, and of course the governor has some initiatives that he is pursuing this year, as he has done in the past, one of which is a raise for teachers, well-deserved. The other is a change in their contracts to make them more accountable, and as the senator has emphasized to me, administrators as well, in terms of accountability. How is that initiative faring on the Education Committee?
Just about all of the elements for the governor's education reform plan have passed, at least passed out of the Education Committee, full committee, and some of them are coming to the floor now, and they are passing. And the beauty of all of that is that last year there were also bills that were put forth that really need a lot of work. There were some good ideas, but they failed to pass out. So that brought the stakeholders to the table this year in accomplishing some of the very same things, but everybody having some input. So the teachers' associations and the teachers have signed on to the plan that we're looking at now. As far as continuing contracts, we're really looking at more of a probationary period, expanding the teacher's probationary period from 3 to 5 years, and that being determined by administrators in education. Of course, they're all happy about the possibility of getting a raise, but that is going to take some cooperation from the localities. And we passed out of the subcommittee the proposal to bring a little bit more transparency into how we grade our schools, because there are 5 levels of determinations that we rank schools into, but we're actually going to be changing those into an ABC type of platform, and which more parents will have an opportunity to digest, and they will recognize immediately what the language means if their school is excelling or falling behind. And that's a good thing, because we want the citizens to be engaged. We want them to be part of the public education situation. So nationwide, there's been a lot of focus on the public schools and concerns from parents. And so I think that the direction that we're moving with some of the education reforms, and now we have teachers involved in the process too, is the right way to go. And I'm expecting that we'll see good things come out of this.
And of course, we know you have a daughter who is a teacher.
I'm very proud of her too.
Great.
Very proud of Casey.
The governor wants to attract more people like your daughter to the state through Teach America. He also wants to encourage the creation of more charter schools. I believe there's some discussion around an amendment to the Constitution which would give jurisdictions to the State Board of Education in terms of who charter schools apply to initially.
That's correct. The governor has been initiating discussions on chartered schools for some period of time. Virginia has been less than vigorous in the acceptance of chartered schools. Brenda serves on the Education Committee. I think there may be 3 or 4 in Virginia, something ridiculous, and there are more than 500 in Florida. It doesn't mean that Florida's doing it right and we're doing it wrong, but there are some very successful charter schools. And currently the charters must be approved by local school boards. Sometimes there is disincentive for them to approve the charter schools because it potentially is a migration of students. There's certainly an inference that maybe the public school system is not performing at the level that parents and children expect. So there is a constitutional amendment moving through the General Assembly that would allow the State Board of Education to do that review process. The only concern that I have is not the constitutional amendment, but I would hope that the State Board of Education would adopt a fairly rigorous examination of the application for chartered schools to make sure not just that their academic curriculum is acceptable, but that their finances are acceptable. That is a major issue, is the financial component of it. But I think diversity of choice in public education in Virginia is a healthy thing. I mean, I'm an old athlete, really old athlete, and competition is a good thing. Competition breeds excellence.
And of course, athletics is before us again. In terms of the Tim Tebow bill, excuse me, which would allow homeschool students to participate in athletics. So, how's that going this year?
Well, it did pass out of committee 2 days ago, and I expect that it will pass out of the full House. It did last year, and I think it's a good bill. I support it. I am a former homeschooler, and with 4 boys that would have liked to participate. They did get their opportunity in Christian school, but during homeschooling they would have liked to have participated. And so I think it's a good thing. I think it'll bring some more diversity into high school sports, and I think the children who were being homeschooled need to be allowed that opportunity to interact with their peers. They do after hours, and so this also gives them an opportunity, extracurricular, to be able to participate.
Tourism and the school calendar year seem to butt heads almost every year, and of course we've got another bill that would do away with the prohibition against beginning school before Labor Day. Where is that going?
You know, it's hard to say. We see that bill every year. For the most part, the House of Delegates has resisted that bill. Last year, I think we did pass it over to the Senate, who they resisted, and I think in wisdom that they did that, because tourism is such a major part of our economy that people need to realize those dollars that we receive through tourism is what funds our public schools and all our other portions that come out of the general fund. So we need those, and if we lose that money, or that money, those funds are eroded, we're going to have to come up with them from somewhere. So we need to make sure we have that balance there, and that balance of understanding that this is for the good of the whole state, that we continue to start school after Labor Day so that we can continue receiving those coveted tourism dollars.
As you know, Senator Norment, the United States Supreme Court upheld the Affordable Care Act last year. In doing so, however, it did give the states a lot more discretion in terms of the acceptance of Medicaid funds and expanding Medicaid coverage for its citizens. Some people say, just like we don't want to rely upon the federal government to pass a law dealing with internet retail sales, we may not want to rely upon the federal government to continue the funding that it has promised, and apparently that's part of the mix in terms of whether the Commonwealth should expand Medicaid.
Well, I think that the federal government has an extraordinarily worse record of standing by its financial promises than almost any state in the Union. And in a vacuum, I understand the Affordable Health Care Act. I don't support the legislation, but it is the law of the land, and that's what we have to deal with. It's interesting to me, as every day goes by, more and more observations come out about it. Just last week, all of a sudden we learned that there is going to be a significant surcharge on those who smoke. Now, I accept that smoking is unhealthy, but the whole idea of affordable health care was to provide universal health care without pre-existing conditions. In other words, you could not be denied health coverage because of a pre-existing condition. But now, if you are a single person that's smoking, they're saying that the surcharge to you, even through the universal health care plan that's going to be made available, is going to be between $4,000 and $5,000 on top of what your normal premium is.
$4,000 or $5,000.
Yeah. So that's a pretty significant amount, and that doesn't exactly sound like accessibility to me. But the reason I point that out is it does make states like Virginia very concerned about what's going on here. Yes, the feds are saying that they're going to pay the early years of the Medicaid expansion, but when that cliff comes, they talk about fiscal cliffs, that is a fiscal cliff that will choke Virginia, because an enormous, in billions of dollars, is going to fall on the Commonwealth of Virginia as soon as the feds stop putting that money in for Medicaid expansion. So the Medicaid expansion, once again, discussed in a vacuum, has some real merits. Where the question comes up, who's going to pay for it in perpetuity? And it's not going to be the federal government. And I assure you that Virginians would be shocked when they see what must be done because of a federal mandate in having to either raise revenues or cut core services in order to meet that. So the governor executively, from an executive standpoint right now, said, we're not doing it.
Right, and I think they are in discussions with Health and Human Services, as I recall, in terms of fashioning something that will satisfy the governor's concerns, especially on the financing end. But obviously that's a concern for you as well.
Yeah, it's a concern for all of us, although, you know, the good news as far as the expansion is concerned is that the price tag has come way down from, I think, $2 billion over the course of 10 years to $137 million, and that's a big difference. So we still, even though we have that good news, and it's another light we need to look at this, the underlying problem is, just as Senator Norment said, is are we going to take that quantum leap of trusting that the federal government is going to hold up to their end of the bargain, because realistically it's hard to conceive how they even possibly could. And, you know, with the debt ceiling hanging over our heads and the talk up in Washington that entitlements are going to have to be cut, and Medicaid is an entitlement, then, you know, we are still in limbo because, number one, financially, we are not able to put our full faith into the federal government following up. And they've projected that they will cover 100% for 3 years. After that, 90% for another amount of years. But just as Senator Norment pointed out, if they default, that leaves the taxpayers of Virginia holding the bag, and not just the taxpayers in limbo, but the recipients as well.
Well, we'll end on that note. We hope that this session is successful for both of you. We look forward to seeing you again. Thank you for being here, Delegate Brenda Pogge and the Senate Majority Leader, Tommy Norment.
Thank you. Thank
you for watching Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Cox Communications. Until next time, I'm Woody Evans. Mm-hmm.